Man, I'm tired. I feel like I've been up all night because Walter just won't stop partying. But then again, maybe he's just excited that in this lesson we're going to be talking about track mattes. Track mattes allow you to define the opacity or transparency of one layer using another. This opens up the possibility to create some really exciting visual effects because it allows you to stamp out an image or shapes or text out of another layer. But party must go on, I guess, so let's jump into Adobe After Effects and start working with track mattes. Back in Adobe After Effects, and let's start out with an empty project. Let's import some footage, and under the course materials, under the video, you will find a Tobias sleeping.mp4 and a Walter in the disco.mp4. So let's bring those two clips into the project. And let's grab the Tobias sleeping mp4 and drag it onto the new composition icon. And it's just a small clip of me in bed, just trying to get some sleep. Let's drag the Walter in the disco clip into that composition and place it right on top. And this is just a clip of Walter showing off his, moves. Now, if you want to blend these two clips together somehow and superimpose them, we'd have various different options. For one, in the mode column within your layers, and again, if you can't see this mode column, come down to the bottom here and click toggle switches and modes, so make sure you see the mode column. You could change the Walter in the disco, let's say from normal over to screen, for example, so you can't just superimpose them. You can also leave the mode on normal, press T, maybe let's lower the opacity, can't just blend them together that way into something a little bit more trippy. But that is all pretty basic. Obviously, we've also learned that you can now simply use masks, so you can take the pen tool, make sure that the Walter in the disco layer is selected, and just draw a mask around Walter. Then you could expand the mask properties and kind of just feather that mask out a little bit. And again, you kind of have a superimposed version of Walter. You can kind of take the top layer and just drag it over a little bit as well, so it kind of replaces the teddy bear. But again, that's nothing really special. Let's delete the mask again and let's talk about track mattes. Now, track mattes allow you to define the opacity of one layer using another layer. In order to demonstrate this, let's come up, select the text tool, and let's type some text. And what I'm going to type is party. Let me drag this over a little bit so you can see that text. There's a huge blob of text. I've actually used Showcard Gothic, but again, just pick any font you want. Just make this fairly big. And make sure that this text layer sits on top of the Walter in the disco clip, because a track matte needs to sit directly above the layer that it affects. So here's this big party text, and on the layer next to the mode column over on the right hand side, you'll find an option for your track matte. Again, click toggle switches and modes if you can't see this column. So you may notice that the party text layer, which is at the top of the composition, doesn't have this option because there is no layer above it. There is no way to set a track matte. However, on the Walter in the disco layer, you have this option for a track matte. If you pop this open, you have 4 different options. You can set it to the alpha matte, so the transparency of the Walter in the disco layer would be defined by the alpha, the transparency of the layer above it, which is that party text. You can use the inverse of that, the alpha inverted. You can also use the luma, the brightness of the text layer, which again we're going to get to in a second, or the inverted brightness. Luma just refers to brightness. It's just a fancier term for it. For now, let's just go super simple and simply say use the alpha of this text. Now, 2 things happened. The text layer, which is now a track matte, has become invisible because usually you don't actually want to see track mattes. If I enabled the visibility again, we're essentially just covering up what we're cutting out of the disco layer. It doesn't really make sense all that much. So let's hide the visibility again, and you'll see this little icon here, this little dot within a square, just indicates that this text layer is now a track matte. And the other thing that has happened, much more importantly, we've now defined the opacity of Walter in the disco to be the transparency of the text. So we now essentially stamp the text out of this layer. If you scrub through, you can see the video is actually playing, except that its transparency is limited to the text above it. The cool thing is that you can actually move and animate your track mattes and they will affect the transparency of the layer below it. So if I select this party layer, again, visibility disabled, so don't need it, and just drag this around, you can see that this layer now essentially defines where exactly our Walter in the disco layer is visible. So I can move this text over to the left-hand side, come to the beginning of my composition, press P to reveal the position property, enable the stopwatch icon. Maybe we'll go forward to about 8 seconds. I'm just going to move this across over to the right-hand side, and you can hold down Shift so it doesn't move up or down. Just going to move this across the screen to the right-hand side. Select both keyframes and press F9. And now if you rewind and play this back, you essentially have the text move across and reveal the water in the disco layer as it's playing back. If that still didn't quite make it clear enough, let's disable the visibility on the Tobias sleeping layer. And everything is black underneath this party text. But again, if you enable the transparency grid, and you can see that the water in the disco layer is only visible where the layer above it, the track matte, is opaque. It has alpha. Now, if on the water in the disco layer you change this track matte over from alpha to alpha inverted, what's obviously going to happen is that the layer above it will essentially just be cut out. So everything is visible except where the layer above it, the track matte, is opaque, has alpha. So this can be very useful if you just want to cut certain pieces based on another layer out of your footage. Let's re-enable the Tobias sleeping layer underneath, and again that will now show through our water in the disco layer. So you can now see me while trying to sleep underneath Walter having a party. In order to explore the other two options, Luma Matte and Luma Inverted, let's go a slightly different route because our text is fully white, so it would kind of behave the same way as Alpha Matte and Alpha Inverted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete my party text layer, and you can see the track matte option has now disappeared on Water in the Disco. And again, it's fully opaque and covering up everything else. Let's create a new solid layer. Let's call this one Noise, make sure it is at the very top of the composition, and I believe this only happens in newer versions of Adobe After Effects. The Water in the Disco layer has essentially remembered that it had a track matte, but for now, let's just change this over to no track matte on the Water in the Disco layer, so the Noise layer is just a black solid right on the top, covering up everything else. Let's come up into the Effects and Presets panel, and let's search for the Turbulent Noise effect. Let's apply the Turbulent Noise effect to our solid layer, and that is just going to generate some, well, turbulent noise. Let's bring up the contrast by quite a bit so we get quite harsh, bright and dark areas. I'm also going to expand the transform section and maybe scale this up a fair bit more so that the patches are a little bit more easy to see. And right now, if you scrub through your composition, it's just really ugly and static, nothing actually changes, so it looks a little bit boring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to animate this evolution property, but let's do something just slightly different, just slightly more advanced, outside of the comfort zone that is the beginner area. But again, it's not going to be too scary. Don't worry about it. Simply hold down Alt or Option if you're on a Mac on the keyboard. Just hold that key down. Then click onto the stopwatch icon next to the evolution property. And this is going to pop open something called the expression editor, which gives you access to a huge amount of advanced features in Adobe After Effects. All you want to do is right here down at the bottom, you've got this little text editor. You want to just wipe out everything that is in here and simply type time *50. So we're automatically animating the evolution to follow along with the time of our composition. Simply click outside of this little text editor into your timeline. This is going to apply this expression, and now without having to add any keyframes, if you scrub through your composition, this noise will animate. And that's why expressions are really great, but again, not going to be part of this course. I just wanted to show you this little trick because it makes it so easy to get this really nice animated noise. Let's collapse this layer again. Let's select our Walter in the Disco layer, and let's change the track matte option from none over to alpha. Yes, alpha. Well, what happened? Right now, the entire layer is opaque. There's no transparency at all because our noise layer, let's re-enable the visibility, while it does have dark spots, it's not actually transparent. It's actually just solid black. So it's fully opaque as well. And so the alpha of this layer, which is absolutely everywhere, now controls the opacity of the Water in the Disco layer, and therefore it's fully opaque. Alpha inverted will make the entire layer invisible because, again, it's just the inverse of the alpha track matte option. But what we want to do, because our noise, again, let's re-enable visibility, has these nice dark and bright spots, what we want to do is I want to change the track matte on my Water in the Disco layer from alpha to luma, to the brightness of the layer above it. So let's change this to luma matte. And now what we have the Water in the Disco layer visible wherever our noise layer is bright. Wherever we have white in this noise layer, our Water in the Disco layer is actually visible. And because we've animated this noise, that changes. So you get this strange undulating pattern happening. You can also change this over to Luma inverted, which will do pretty much what you expect it to do. It's essentially the inverse of that. So now wherever the noise layer above is dark, our water in the disco layer will be visible. So this allows you to create some really trippy effects, and it does become really useful when you're compositing together a whole bunch of different shapes and patterns and textures and stock footage and base elements, and all of that needs to get blended. Track mattes are hugely powerful because they let you create some effects that you couldn't create with any other tools, and they are used in a whole lot of visual effects. Let's do one last thing just to show you something that looks a little bit more like something that you may use in a movie to create a bit of a trippy effect. Let's delete the noise layer again, but before we do that, let's just change the track matte from Luma inverted over to none, just so we don't remember it. So let's delete the noise layer on top. Let's duplicate this water in the disco layer and rename this layer to matte. Then come over into your Effects and Presets panel and search for the Hue and Saturation effect. Let's apply this effect to the matte layer. Let's drain all the saturation out of it. Let's just drain this down to 0, so we just get a black and white image. You don't really have to, it just makes it easier to work with in my opinion. Next, come back into your Effects and Presets panel and let's search for a Curves effect. Let's apply the effect to the matte layer. And in this curve, this is just a color curve essentially. What I want to do is I want to click and drag at the top end to brighten up the bright parts, and then click and drag down in the bottom end to darken the dark parts. I'm going to create a really contrasty, very harsh contrasty image with some bright parts and some black parts. So maybe soften this out just a little bit, just play around a little bit, not going to go into too much detail. What I want to do now that I've got this layer defined here with water in the disco, I'm going to use this as a track matte on my actual water in the disco layer beneath it. So on the water in the disco layer, which sits underneath your matte layer, change the track matte option from none over to Luma. Now what we've created a really trippy effect where water is essentially, wherever that layer is bright, visible and overlaying our base footage. Now, unfortunately, this seems to be covering up my face a little bit too much, so I'm actually going to change this track matte from Luma to Luma inverted. This creates a really interesting and trippy effect where only the dark parts of the water in the disco layer are actually visible and overlaying the base footage. The key takeaway here is really that this is not something that you could do with masks or blend modes or by adjusting the opacity. This is something where you do need track mattes, but they're really easy to use, they're really powerful, and they allow you to create some really interesting and really cool looking visual effects.